The Hells Angels biker found the little girl forced into a room bearing his patch, and his strike ended a legacy of fear. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was a cold, damp evening when Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels biker known for his ruthless reputation, rode down the highway on his motorcycle. The heavy hum of his bike was the only sound, muffling the winds that howled around him. As he neared an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, a faint sound caught his attention. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make him slow his bike. A faint cry echoed in the distance, almost as if it was calling for help. He glanced around the desolate landscape, the fading light of the day creating long shadows. There, in the darkness, he spotted something. A figure in the window of the dilapidated building. His instincts kicked in. Reaper wasn't the type to get involved in situations like this. After all, a man like him had learned long ago to avoid distractions. But something about the cry, the vulnerability in the sound, made him stop. He dismounted from his bike and approached the building cautiously. The air was thick with tension, and as he stepped inside, his heart began to race. The faint cries grew louder, clearer, and there, in the corner of the room, was a little girl. She was huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the patch on his leather jacket. Her breath was shallow, her small body trembling, and the room around her was cold and dark. Reaper's gaze locked onto the girl for a moment. Her eyes, full of terror and pain, reminded him of his own past, the people he couldn't save, the mistakes he had made. He wasn't sure why, but something in him softened. He had seen the worst of humanity, but this was different. The girl looked at him, recognizing the Hells Angels logo on his back, and for a moment, she flinched, afraid he would hurt her. But Reaper wasn't here to hurt her. He wasn't sure what to do, but he knew he couldn't leave her like this. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl's eyes filled with tears as she wiped them away with trembling hands. She couldn't speak, but the terror in her eyes said everything. Reaper knelt down, careful not to make any sudden movements. He had always been the one to strike fear into others, but now, seeing the fear in the girl's eyes, he realized how powerless he truly was. His past, filled with violence and intimidation, had brought him nothing but emptiness. But this moment, this connection, was different. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something deep inside, a desire to protect. He reached out a hand to her. "It's all right. You're safe now." But the girl recoiled, too afraid to trust him. She had been hurt, betrayed, and she thought all men like him were the same. Reaper took a deep breath and backed away, giving her space. "I won't hurt you," he repeated, his voice low and calm. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew he couldn't just leave her here. As the girl slowly began to calm, Reaper looked around the room. It was obvious she had been here for a while. The walls were cold, and there were remnants of discarded food and old, tattered blankets on the floor. He didn't know her story, but he could guess it wasn't a good one. He had learned enough about pain and abandonment to recognize it in others. The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't leave me." Those words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent so many years running from his own demons, trying to numb the pain with the Hells Angels, but now, standing in front of this frightened child, he realized he had a choice. He could walk away, leave her in the dark, or he could make a decision to stay. Reaper didn't know what the right choice was, but for the first time in a long while, he chose to stay. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. "I'm getting you out of here." His decision was made, but the road ahead was uncertain. He didn't know who had done this to her, but he would find out, and he would make sure they paid. This was the beginning of something that would change him forever, and he was ready to face whatever came next. "I'm not leaving you," Reaper said firmly, his voice now taking on a tone of resolve. The girl, still trembling, watched him cautiously, unsure of whether she could trust him. But as she saw the sincerity in his eyes, something within her slowly started to ease. Reaper stood up and turned his gaze toward the door. His mind was racing, thinking about what to do next. He couldn't leave her here. It was clear that she had been through hell, and he wasn't about to let her endure any more pain. "I'll get you out of here," he repeated, more to himself than to her. The girl didn't say anything, but the way she slowly stood up, her small frame barely managing to hold herself upright, told Reaper all he needed to know. She was ready to trust him, just a little. As he approached her, he could see the marks of fear in her eyes, a fear that had clearly been burned into her soul. She was alone in this world, and the last thing she needed was more fear. Reaper stepped closer to her, his heart softening. He couldn't let this girl face the world on her own, not after everything she had been through. "Come on," he said gently, offering his hand. "Let's get out of here." The girl hesitated for a moment, before slowly reaching out and taking his hand. They walked toward the door together, the storm outside still howling with intensity. But it felt different now, like the air had shifted. Reaper was no longer just a biker in a leather jacket. He was something more, someone who had a purpose. They made their way through the broken-down building, the creaking floorboards echoing under their footsteps. As they reached the exit, the wind howled louder, and the cold air rushed in, biting at their skin. Reaper pulled his jacket tighter around the girl's shoulders. She looked up at him with gratitude in her eyes, her small hand gripping his tightly. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reaper looked down at her, his heart aching. "I've got a place," he said. "You'll be safe there." They stepped into the night, the harsh wind cutting through the air as they made their way toward the motorcycle. Reaper could feel the weight of the girl's hand in his, and it reminded him of all the mistakes he had made in his life. He had spent years in the Hell's Angels, fighting, living for the rush, but it never filled the emptiness inside. Now, with this girl in his care, he felt something different, a sense of responsibility that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her behind. As they reached the bike, Reaper helped her onto the back, making sure she was secure before starting the engine. The roar of the Harley was deafening, but to Reaper, it felt like the start of something new. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face it. They rode through the night, the storm still raging, but somehow it felt more manageable. The girl clung to him, her small frame pressed against his back, but there was something in her grip now, something stronger than fear. She was starting to trust him. As they approached the outskirts of town, Reaper's thoughts began to shift. He didn't know where he was taking her exactly, but he knew he couldn't keep running from his own past. The Hell's Angels had taught him how to survive, but they had also taken everything from him. The one thing he had left was his chance at redemption. And maybe, just maybe, he could start that redemption with this little girl. They arrived at his garage, the dim light of the single bulb hanging overhead casting long shadows. Reaper helped the girl off the bike, steadying her as she wobbled slightly. The garage was empty, save for the remnants of his past, a place where he had fixed bikes, where he had once found solace in the clanging of metal and the scent of oil. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. "This is it," Reaper said, looking around. "It's not much, but it'll keep you safe." The girl didn't say anything at first, but the way she looked around, the space told him everything. She was scared, but she was also beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Reaper went to the back of the garage, pulling out a few blankets and setting up a small space for her to rest. "I'll get you something to eat," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll figure this out." The girl nodded silently, watching him with a mix of fear and trust. As he turned to leave the garage, he glanced back at her. She was small, fragile, but there was a spark in her that reminded him of the girl he used to know, the one who had once trusted him before everything went wrong. For the first time in a long time, Reaper felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. The storm outside had calmed, but inside, the storm was just beginning. I woke up the next morning to the sound of rain tapping against the garage roof. It was still dark outside, the early morning mist clinging to everything it touched. Reaper had spent the night pacing around the small garage, thinking. His mind wasn't at peace. He glanced at the girl, now lying on the old couch he'd made up for her. She was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in what looked like ages. He had no idea where to go from here, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. As the day broke, he went to work in silence. The motorcycle engine he had been fixing the day before still lay in pieces across the workbench, but his focus wasn't on the bike. His thoughts kept drifting back to the girl. He had learned how to survive in a world full of violence, but this was different. The girl, with her soft eyes and quiet voice, had shifted something inside him. He wasn't used to feeling protective, but now it was almost instinctual. He glanced over at her again, making sure she was still asleep. Something had happened last night. He hadn't expected to feel this way about anyone ever again. But it was more than that. It was the way she had looked at him, the trust she had shown. Reaper had spent most of his life pushing people away, living in a world of quick decisions and even quicker betrayals. Now, here he was, caught in a situation where he wanted to do something good. He wasn't sure how to handle it, but he knew that for once, he wanted to be better. A few hours later, she woke up, rubbing her eyes and looking around the garage in confusion. It wasn't much, a few workbenches, old tools scattered across the floor, the faint smell of motor oil in the air. Reaper glanced up from his work when he heard her stir. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from not speaking much the day before. She nodded at him, still unsure of how to respond. Reaper stood up from his seat, walking over to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, but he saw the way her gaze flickered to the corner of the room, where the old blankets were still spread out. She was scared. That much was clear. Reaper hadn't expected her to jump into the idea of safety so easily. She had been through things he couldn't even begin to understand. "I'm all right," she said finally, her voice small, hesitant. He could see she wasn't convinced. "You're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you." She seemed to take comfort in his words, but her eyes were still filled with doubt. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. It was a question Reaper wasn't sure how to answer. He had no real reason to help her other than the fact that he couldn't leave her behind. He had seen too much violence, too much pain in his life, and this time, he wanted to do something different. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "I'm not going to let you go through this alone." She looked at him, a little surprised. Maybe it was the sincerity in his voice, or maybe she was just tired of being alone. Either way, she didn't argue. Reaper stepped back and walked toward the door of the garage, looking out at the storm still raging outside. "I need to go out for a bit," he said. "I'll be back soon." "Stay here, all right." She nodded, though her face was clouded with worry. "I'll be here," she whispered. Reaper didn't want to leave her alone. He knew she was frightened, but he needed to make sure she would be safe in the long run. He couldn't keep hiding from his past, and he couldn't keep running from the people who had hurt him, and now her. When he stepped outside into the storm, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. The wind was harsh, and the rain fell in sheets, but he didn't care. He had a mission now. He wasn't just running away from his past. He had to face it. He had to make sure the people who hurt her were held accountable. He had no idea how he was going to do it, but he knew he wasn't going to back down. Reaper walked to his bike, his hands tightening around the handlebars. The rain didn't bother him. He had ridden in worse weather. But this time, it wasn't just about the ride. It was about doing something good, something that would change everything. The girl's face flashed in his mind, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore, and he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her again. As he revved the engine and drove off into the storm, he felt the change. Something was different. He wasn't just a Hell's Angel anymore. He was a protector, and he was ready to fight for the people who needed it most. "I can't believe you actually left," Sarah whispered as she sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where Reaper had been just hours ago. The storm outside was still raging, but the storm inside her was something different, something unfamiliar. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Reaper's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening. He wasn't just a biker. He was something more, and as much as she wanted to deny it, she was starting to feel that he was the only one who could protect her. Reaper had left to face his past, the demons that had haunted him for years. The storm outside matched his mood, dark and violent. He had to make things right, had to go back to the people who had once been his family, the Hell's Angels. But he wasn't just going to confront them for himself. He was doing it for her, the girl he had found, the girl he was starting to care for. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or how they would react, but he knew he had to face them. His mind was focused, his hands tight around the handlebars of his Harley as he rode through the rain. The road ahead was uncertain, But for the first time in years, it felt like he had a purpose. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He had no time for distractions. He wasn't running anymore. The headlights of his bike cut through the darkness, but all he could think about was Sarah. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't about to let anyone get in his way. As he neared the old clubhouse, his heart began to pound. The familiar smell of gasoline and oil filled the air, but it didn't bring the same comfort it once had. It was no longer just about the brotherhood. It was about making things right. He parked his bike outside the dilapidated building, the neon lights flickering above him. The place looked abandoned, like it had been left to rot, just like everything else in his life. But this was where it all started. This was where he had been welcomed into the Hells Angels, where he had earned his place. But now, it felt different. He wasn't the same man he had been all those years ago. He had seen too much, lost too much, to keep pretending. Reaper walked through the door, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The familiar faces turned to him as he stepped inside, their eyes narrowing. The tension in the room was palpable. He could feel their eyes on him, weighing him down. "Reaper," said one of the older members, his voice cold. "What the hell are you doing here?" Reaper didn't flinch. He had come for one reason, and he wasn't going to back down. "I need to talk," he said, his voice steady. But there was a hardness in it that hadn't been there before. "About what?" the man asked, his eyes narrowed, studying Reaper's every move. Reaper didn't hesitate. "I'm done with the brotherhood. I'm done with all of it." The room went silent. The air seemed to thicken as the words sank in. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the anger in their eyes was something he had seen before. "You're making a mistake," another member spat. "This isn't something you walk away from. You don't just quit." Reaper stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man who had spoken. "I'm not quitting. I'm choosing something different." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Reaper thought they might come at him. But then the older man who had spoken first took a step back, his expression unreadable. "You're not the same man who walked in here all those years ago," he said, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "Maybe that's the point," Reaper muttered under his breath. "Maybe I'm done being that man." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Reaper felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't back down. He had made his choice. He had to make it right. He had to protect the girl. He couldn't go back to the life he once had. As he turned to leave, one of the members called out to him. "Don't think you can just walk away without consequences," he said, his voice cold. Reaper stopped, his back to them. "I know there will be consequences, but I'm ready for them," he said without turning around. He walked out the door, the sound of the rain filling the air again as he mounted his bike. He didn't look back. The brotherhood was behind him now, but the road ahead wasn't any clearer. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he couldn't go back. He had made his decision, and he was going to live with it. As Reaper rode back to the garage, he thought about Sarah. She was the reason he had made this choice. She was the reason he was willing to fight. He had to protect her, no matter what. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he would find a way. The rain had stopped, but the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Reaper felt like he was on the right path. "I don't know how things got so twisted," Reaper muttered under his breath, riding down the highway, his thoughts racing faster than his motorcycle. The night had been long, and the fight at the clubhouse had drained him, but there was no time for rest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something darker than just his past. His mind drifted back to Sarah, the girl he had promised to protect. He had left her alone in that garage, and even though he had told her to stay put, a nagging feeling of guilt gnawed at him. What if something happened while he was gone? What if she was in danger? The road blurred beneath him as the Harley roared to life beneath his grip, the wind howling around him. He kept his eyes ahead, focused, but the storm of emotions inside him was far more intense than anything the weather could throw at him. He had made his choice. He couldn't keep running from his past, from the people he had hurt. But at the same time, he couldn't let Sarah face whatever it was alone. Not anymore. He pulled up to the garage, his bike screeching to a stop as he jumped off. The air was thick with tension, and as he stepped inside, he saw Sarah standing by the workbench, her face pale but calm. She had been waiting for him, but he couldn't tell if she had been worried or just too afraid to move. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something in them, something that made him believe she had faith in him. For a moment, they just stood there, both of them unsure of what to say next. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart, but he wasn't here to talk about feelings. He was here to protect her, to make sure she was safe. "Are you okay?" he asked, taking a step closer. She nodded, but the hesitation in her eyes told him she wasn't. She wasn't okay, not by a long shot. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the words didn't carry any conviction. Reaper could see it in the way she shifted uncomfortably, her hands trembling at her sides. He could tell she was holding something back, something important. "You're not fine," he said gently, stepping closer to her. "What happened while I was gone?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering around the room, avoiding his gaze. "I don't want to talk about it," she said softly, almost too softly. Reaper could see the way her chest rose and fell, the way she fought to keep it together. Something had happened, something that had shaken her more than she was letting on. And he knew he couldn't leave it like that. He had promised to protect her, and if she couldn't speak about it, then he would find another way to help. He stepped toward her, this time gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, I need you to trust me," he said quietly. "Whatever happened, you don't have to go through it alone." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, her breath shaky. Reaper felt the weight of her fear, and for a moment, it felt like he was carrying it too. He had been carrying his own for so long, but now, he realized, he was willing to face it for her. He would face whatever was coming, no matter the cost. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll stay with you." That was all he needed to hear. Reaper nodded, a determined look crossing his face. "We'll face it together," he said firmly. There was no turning back now. He had to do whatever it took to protect her. They couldn't hide from the past forever, but they could fight back. And that was exactly what he was going to do. He turned away from her and walked over to the old toolbox, grabbing a few tools that might help. "We need to move fast," he said. "There's no telling what's waiting for us out there." He turned back to Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and trust in her eyes. It was all so new, this feeling of responsibility, but it was something he was starting to embrace. He wasn't just a Hell's Angel anymore. He was a protector, and he wasn't about to let anyone hurt her. As Reaper prepared to face whatever danger lay ahead, his thoughts briefly returned to the clubhouse and the men he had left behind. He had burned his bridges with them, and he knew it. They wouldn't just let him go without consequences. But he couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. He was done with the Hell's Angels, done with their violence, their lies. And if they came after him, he would fight back. But for now, he had a more important fight to win, keeping Sarah safe. As the rain started to fall again, heavier this time, Reaper grabbed his jacket and handed it to Sarah. "We're leaving," he said. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't let go." Sarah nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. For the first time in a long time, Reaper felt like he had a purpose. And as they stepped out into the storm, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. "I don't know what I was thinking," Reaper muttered under his breath as he revved the Harley engine to life, the engine roaring loudly against the thick silence of the early morning. The area was isolated, with only a few lights hanging overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Reaper turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, listening. He was alert now, every sense on edge. Something didn't feel right. "We need to get inside," he said, his voice low. Sarah didn't ask questions. She trusted him now, and that was all that mattered. He helped her off the bike and led her toward a small door at the back of the warehouse. The door creaked open with a groan, and they stepped inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood and rust, the faint scent of motor oil lingering from years of use. The space was dimly lit, with only a few broken windows letting in what little light the night had left. Reaper had been here before, years ago. It was a safe place. For now, it would have to do. "Stay here," Reaper said as he turned to close the door behind them. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide, but she didn't speak. She was still processing everything. She didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but she would soon. Reaper's thoughts turned to the Hell's Angels. He knew they were coming. They always did. And when they did, it wasn't going to be pretty. He couldn't let them find him, not with Sarah here. She was vulnerable, and he couldn't risk her safety. He needed to make sure they had time to get away. But he knew time was running out. He moved quickly, pulling out a few items from his bag. weapons he hadn't touched in years. He wasn't a killer, not anymore, but he would do whatever it took to protect Sarah. The door creaked again, and Reaper froze, his muscles tensing. He turned his head slowly to see Sarah standing by the window, her eyes scanning the street outside. "Reaper," she said quietly, "I think they're here." Reaper's heart skipped a beat as he moved toward her, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gaze. Two motorcycles pulled up to the alleyway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. He could see the figures on the bikes, their silhouettes familiar. The Hells Angels. His gut tightened, and he knew it was time to face what he had been avoiding. There was no more running. No more hiding. The bikers dismounted and began walking toward the building, their footsteps echoing off the concrete. Reaper glanced at Sarah, who was standing still, her face pale. "Get back," he whispered, "stay out of sight." Sarah nodded, stepping into the shadows as Reaper moved toward the back of the warehouse. The door was still open a crack, enough for him to see the men approaching. His mind raced, calculating the best course of action. He had no intention of fighting them, but he couldn't let them think he was weak. He had to stand his ground. He couldn't let them take Sarah. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. As the men approached, Reaper stepped out from the shadows, his face a mask of determination. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. The men stopped in their tracks, eyeing him carefully. "We've got unfinished business, Reaper," one of them growled. Reaper stepped forward, his fists clenched. "No, we don't. I'm done with you and your games." The tension in the air was thick. Sarah was watching from the corner of the warehouse, her heart racing, unsure of what would happen next. Reaper didn't flinch. He had made his decision. He wasn't going to go back. He wasn't going to let them control him anymore. "You made your choice," the biker said, his voice cold. "And now, we're going to make ours." The sound of the other bikes revving outside told Reaper all he needed to know. They were ready for a fight. And so was he. "I don't have time for this," Reaper growled, his voice thick with the weight of years spent in the Hells Angels, in a world where loyalty meant everything, and betrayal, nothing. The men who stood before him were his past, people he had once called brothers. But that was before. Now, there was only him and Sarah. And he'd be damned if they were going to take that from him. The lead biker, Steele, took a step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel of the alley. "You think you can just walk away, Reaper? You don't get to leave. Not like this." His voice was sharp, filled with an anger that seemed to simmer just below the surface. Reaper's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles cracking as he held them at his sides. His mind raced, thinking about the girl inside the warehouse, the one he had promised to protect. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He wouldn't. "I don't want to fight you, Steele," Reaper said, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm that raged inside him. "But if it's a fight you want, then I'm ready." Steele smirked, the expression twisted with contempt. "You're nothing but a traitor, Reaper. You think you're better than us now? You think you can just throw away everything we've built?" Reaper shook his head. "No. I'm done with the blood, the violence. I've seen enough. But I'm not backing down. Not now." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy, but Steele wasn't listening. He had made up his mind. "You don't get to choose, Reaper. We do." With a sharp motion, Steele lunged forward, throwing a punch aimed directly at Reaper's jaw. Reaper reacted instinctively, his body moving faster than his mind. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and countered with a punch to Steele's midsection. The force of the hit sent Steele stumbling back, but he quickly regained his balance, his face twisted with rage. "You've changed, Reaper," Steele spat, wiping blood from his lip. "And that's why you're going to pay." The other bikers stepped forward, surrounding Reaper, their faces filled with the same anger and betrayal. They were ready to finish what Steele had started. Reaper's heart raced, but his mind remained focused. He had to get out of here. Not for him, but for Sarah. He could hear her voice in his head, a whisper of concern. He couldn't let them take her. Not when he had come this far. "You want to fight?" Reaper's voice was cold, every word deliberate. "Then let's finish this." He took a step back, assessing the situation. There were too many of them. They were strong, experienced fighters. But Reaper had something they didn't, determination. He wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. Steele charged again, this time bringing a knife with him, a flash of metal in the low light. Reaper's eyes locked onto the blade, but he didn't hesitate. He ducked once more, his body moving with the grace of someone who had spent years on the road, evading threats and violence. The knife missed him by inches, the sharp tip grazing his jacket as it passed. Reaper kicked out, his foot catching Steele's knee and sending him to the ground with a howl of pain. The others closed in, but Reaper didn't falter. He was a Hell's Angel, yes, but he was also a man who had seen too much, done too much, and he wasn't afraid anymore. As the bikers advanced, Reaper took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing in determination. He wasn't going down without a fight. He would make sure Sarah was safe. "This is your last chance," Reaper said, his voice low and dangerous. "Walk away." Steele slowly got to his feet, his eyes burning with fury. "You don't get to tell me what to do, Reaper," he snarled. With a sudden, explosive movement, Steele lunged again, his knife aimed directly at Reaper's chest. But Reaper was ready. He sidestepped, grabbing Steele's arm and twisting it with the strength of years spent in combat. The knife clattered to the ground as Steele cried out in pain, clutching his wrist. "I told you," Reaper said, his voice calm but deadly. "Walk away." The remaining bikers hesitated, their eyes flicking between their fallen leader and Reaper. There was no loyalty left here, just anger and fear. Reaper took a step back, his breath steady. He didn't want to fight them, but he wasn't going to let them hurt Sarah. Steele's men backed away, realizing that the fight was over. Steele, still clutching his wrist, glared at Reaper. "This isn't over, Reaper." He spat, his words filled with venom. "You'll pay for this. We'll make sure of it." Reaper didn't respond. He didn't need to. They had said their piece. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to let anyone take Sarah from him. As Steele and his men walked away, Reaper turned and walked back toward the warehouse. He could feel the weight of their eyes on his back, but he didn't care. Sarah was waiting for him, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. "I don't know what's worse," Reaper muttered under his breath as he watched Steele and his crew retreat into the night. "Facing the Hell's Angels or facing myself?" The words felt strange, foreign even. He had spent his entire life in the club, surrounded by its rules, its loyalty, and its violence. Yet, now, after everything he had done, everything he had lost, it all felt like a lifetime ago. The fight had been inevitable, but what had really hurt him wasn't the violence. It was the realization that his brothers were no longer his brothers. They were just ghosts of a past life, one that he was done with. As he walked back into the warehouse, the cold, damp air hit him like a punch in the face. It wasn't just the weather, it was the weight of what had happened, of what had changed. Sarah was sitting on the couch, looking out the window. Her posture was tense, her small frame rigid as she tried to process everything. She hadn't moved much since he had left, but Reaper could see the fear still in her eyes. It was the same fear that had haunted her from the start, but now, it was different. Now, she was facing something much bigger than her past. She was facing his. "You okay?" Reaper asked softly, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. Sarah looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes tired. She had been through too much, and he knew that. "I will be," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you?" The question caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being asked about himself, but the truth was, he didn't know. He was stuck between two worlds, the world he had left behind, and the one he was trying to build. He had spent so many years running from his past, but now, for the first time, it felt like he couldn't outrun it anymore. "I'm not sure," he said finally, walking over to the workbench and leaning against it. His hands were still shaking slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the anger, the frustration, the regret. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah didn't say anything at first, but Reaper could see her studying him, trying to understand the man he had become. The biker who had once thrived on chaos, now fighting to keep things from falling apart. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice small. Reaper sighed, rubbing his hand across his face. "They will," he said, his voice low. "It's only a matter of time." The tension in the air was thick, but it wasn't just about the Hell's Angels. It was about the future, what came next. What kind of life could they have now? The storm outside had passed, but it felt like another one was brewing. "We'll be ready," he added. "But for now, we need to stay low. Stay hidden." Sarah nodded, her eyes flicking toward the door. Reaper could tell that she was scared. She had every right to be. But in that moment, he felt something inside him stir. It wasn't just the need to protect her, it was the need to protect himself too. To rebuild. to find a way out of the life that had nearly destroyed him. "We'll get through this," he said, more to himself than to her. "Together." Sarah's gaze softened, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Reaper knew what she was thinking. She was still unsure if she could trust him completely, if he could really keep her safe. But he didn't need her to trust him. Not yet. All he needed was the chance to prove it. He wasn't going to let her down. He wasn't going to let himself down. Reaper walked over to the corner of the room, pulling out his old leather jacket and throwing it over his shoulder. The jacket that had once marked him as a Hell's Angel now felt like a weight, but he wasn't ready to give it up. Not yet. Not until he knew what it meant to truly walk away. He looked back at Sarah, who had risen from the couch, her posture a little less tense now. She was still uncertain, still fragile, but there was something in her eyes now. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. He could see it. "I'm going to take care of this," he said, nodding toward the door. "You stay here, lock up, and don't answer the door for anyone." She nodded again, but this time, there was something different in her expression. Trust. A little more trust than before. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Reaper turned and stepped outside into the night, the cool air hitting him again. He had no idea where this was going, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to his old life. He had to protect Sarah, and to do that, he needed to face what was coming. The Hell's Angels weren't going to give up. He knew that, but he wasn't going to make it easy for them. Not anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Reaper felt like he was on the right path. He didn't know how long it would take or what the cost would be, but he was ready to pay it. He was ready to face whatever came next. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me as I stepped outside. The cool breeze cut through my jacket, but it wasn't the cold that made my heart race. It was the fear that had started to creep back in. The Hell's Angels weren't done with me yet, and even though I had walked away from their twisted world, I knew they wouldn't just let me go without consequences. They'd come after me, and worse, they'd come after Sarah. I couldn't let that happen. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the steady hum of the engine as I fired up the Harley. The low rumble felt like an old companion, the bike I had relied on for so many years. But this time, it wasn't just about me. It was about keeping her safe. I had made promises I was determined to keep. The streetlights flashed as I drove through the city, the familiar routes looking foreign in the dim light of the early morning. There was no telling where the Hell's Angels were, or what kind of trouble they were planning. But I had to find out. I couldn't let them get to her. The city was a maze of alleys and narrow roads, but I knew where to go. The old garage was still there, tucked away in a part of town no one bothered with anymore. I hadn't been back since I walked away, but now, I needed to make sure nothing had changed. Nothing was left for them to use against me. When I pulled up in front of the building, the lights were off. Everything was still. Too still. It felt wrong. I killed the engine and stepped off the bike, my boots hitting the pavement with a muted thud. There was no sound. No movement. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, it was dark, except for the faint moonlight coming through the broken windows. My eyes scanned the room, looking for any signs of life, or any sign that they had been here. The place was as empty as I left it, the tools and bikes collecting dust. But there was something about the stillness that bothered me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Reaper." The voice came from behind me, low and dangerous. I spun around, my body already tensing, ready to react. Steele, the last person I wanted to see. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the streetlights outside. His face was hard, but his eyes, they were filled with something else. Something I couldn't quite place. "I told you it wasn't over," Steele said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk away from this, from us, and there wouldn't be any consequences? You're dead wrong." I didn't flinch, but my mind was already racing. I wasn't afraid of Steele. I wasn't afraid of any of them. But Sarah, she couldn't be involved in this. I couldn't let her get hurt. "This is over, Steele," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You can tell whoever's left that I'm done. I'm not a part of this anymore." Steele stepped into the room, his boots thudding against the floor. "You think it's that easy? You think you can just walk away and everything's going to be fine?" He laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the empty space. "You don't get to decide that, Reaper. You made a choice when you put on that patch. And now, you're going to pay for breaking the code." "I've broken your code, not mine." I said, stepping forward, keeping my eyes locked on his. And I'm not going to fight you. I don't need to. Steele's eyes narrowed. Oh, you think you've won, don't you? But you haven't. You've made enemies of the wrong people, and that's something you don't get to undo. I could feel the tension building, the weight of the past threatening to come crashing down. But I wasn't about to let it. I'm not your enemy anymore, Steele, I said quietly. And you're not mine. But I swear to you, if you try to hurt her, I'll destroy everything you have. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Steele let out a deep breath and looked around the room, his gaze landing on the bike I had ridden in on. You really think you can hide from this, Reaper? You think you can just ride off into the sunset and everything's going to be all right? He shook his head. It doesn't work like that. You're still one of us, whether you like it or not. And if you think you can run, you're wrong. I clenched my fists at my sides, my jaw tightening. I had walked away, but it seemed that the Hell's Angels weren't done with me. And if they weren't done with me, then they sure as hell weren't done with Sarah. Steele took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You've got one choice, Reaper. Join us again, or we'll make you regret it. You'll be dead in the gutter, just like every other washed-up biker who couldn't keep up with the real world. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air between us. But I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let this define me anymore. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let them take her. You don't scare me anymore, Steele, I said, my voice steady. And you never will again. I stood there, face to face with Steele, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. My chest tightened, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he was right. Could I really escape this life? Could I really leave behind the Hell's Angels and everything that came with it? But then I thought of Sarah. I thought of the girl who had come into my life, someone I never expected to care about. And that was all I needed. I wasn't going back. Not for anything. You can keep your threats, Steele, I said, my voice low and steady. You can keep the club and all the shit that comes with it. I'm done. Steele stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied me, like he was trying to read me, trying to find some weakness. But there was nothing. I had made my choice. I wasn't going to be the man I used to be. I wasn't going to live in the shadows anymore. Steele let out a sharp laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. You think you're the first to walk away from the club? He spat. You think you're the first to try and play hero? You're nothing. You'll always be one of us, whether you like it or not. His words stung, but I didn't let it show. I had heard it all before, and it didn't matter anymore. I'm not one of you anymore, Steele, I said, my voice growing colder with each word. I left that behind, and I'm never coming back. He took a step back, his face hardening. The tension in the room thickened, and I knew he was about to do something. I could feel it in the air, like a storm ready to break. But I wasn't going to flinch. I wasn't going to back down. You're making a mistake, Steele said, his voice dropping to a low growl. And you'll regret it. The club will make sure of that. I shook my head, my eyes locked on his. You think I'm afraid of the club? You think I'm afraid of you? I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. I've seen the worst of you. I've seen what you do to people. And I'm not scared anymore. Steele's eyes flickered with something. Rage, maybe fear, or maybe both. But he didn't say anything. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then, as if the tension couldn't hold anymore, Steele let out a sharp whistle. The sound echoed in the stillness of the garage, a signal to his men, I assumed. But as I glanced over his shoulder, I saw no one. Steele smirked, watching me closely. You're not going to win this, Reaper, he said, his tone almost too calm. You think you've outsmarted us? You think you've won? We'll find you. And when we do, it won't be pretty. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already won. I had walked away from everything that had held me captive for so long. I wasn't going to be a pawn in their game anymore. I had a life to build now, with Sarah. And that was worth more than anything the Hell's Angels could ever offer me. If you think I'm afraid of what comes next, I said, my voice steady, you're wrong. I'm ready for whatever comes. Steele's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might attack, but he stopped himself. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with frustration. You're not the man you used to be, Reaper, he said, his voice low, almost regretful. And that's your downfall. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I wasn't the man I used to be. I was someone else now. Someone stronger. Someone who had a purpose. You want to leave? Steele asked, his eyes narrowing. Then leave. But don't think for a second that this is over. It's never over. I didn't need his words. I didn't need his approval. I had already made my choice. It is over, I said firmly. For me, at least. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. I could feel Steele's gaze on my back, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had already walked away. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with the weight of everything that had happened. As I stepped out into the night, I felt a sense of freedom. The kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The past was behind me. And ahead, I had something new to protect. Sarah. I wasn't going to let her down. I wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of keeping her safe. The Hell's Angels were a part of my past, but they weren't my future. As I mounted my bike and started the engine, the roar of the Harley was louder than ever. I wasn't running anymore. I was fighting for something. Someone. And I would keep fighting, no matter what. I didn't look back. Not once. The night air was cold as I sped down the road, the weight of everything that had happened still lingering in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that Steele was right about one thing. This wasn't over. But I wasn't going to let that dictate my life anymore. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. I had Sarah to protect now, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. The motorcycle's engine roared as I twisted the throttle, the world around me blurring as the city disappeared in the rearview mirror. I couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The Hell's Angels would come for me. That was a given. But the only thing I could do now was prepare for what was to come. I was done running. The weight of my old life hung heavy on my shoulders, but I carried it differently now. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't about the past or the Hell's Angels. It was about keeping Sarah safe. She was counting on me. The road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of possibility, but I knew there was no easy way out of this. There was no perfect solution, no way to guarantee her safety. I just had to do the best I could. I had to keep moving. I had to keep fighting. When I finally arrived at the old cabin, I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly snuffed out by the weight of the silence that greeted me. The place was still and dark, as if the world had forgotten it existed. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder from the storm that had passed hours ago. The cabin was tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might be looking for us. It was small, but it would be enough for now. Enough to keep Sarah safe, at least for the time being. I parked the bike outside and approached the door slowly, making sure no one was watching. My instincts were on high alert, but the place was quiet, too quiet. I reached for the door and pushed it open, the creak of the old wood echoing through the still air. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and forgotten memories, but there was something else, something that felt like home. I glanced over at Sarah, who had been quiet during the ride. She hadn't said much since the confrontation with Steele, but I knew she was scared. I could see it in her eyes. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. I walked over to the small kitchen area, setting my jacket down on the counter as I tried to figure out what to do next. I needed a plan. I needed to get Sarah settled, make sure she was safe, but I also needed to prepare for what was coming. I couldn't stay here forever. The Hell's Angels would eventually catch up, and when they did, they wouldn't be merciful. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my head. I had to focus. I had to be strong. For Sarah. She was in the other room. Now, sitting quietly on the couch. Her small frame was curled up in the corner, her eyes wide and distant. She wasn't crying, but I could tell she was on edge, her mind racing. Sarah. I called gently, walking into the room. She looked up at me, her eyes meeting mine. I need you to listen to me. I know things are crazy right now, but I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Do you understand? She nodded slowly, but there was still that look in her eyes. She didn't believe me. Not completely. And I couldn't blame her. I hadn't given her much reason to trust me. Not yet. But I would. I had to. I knelt down in front of her, keeping my voice soft but firm. You're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you. But we need to stay alert. We need to be ready for anything. She looked at me, her lips trembling slightly. I'm scared, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but I heard it loud and clear. The fear in her voice cut through me like a knife. I didn't want her to be scared. I didn't want her to feel alone. I know you are, I said, reaching out to gently take her hand in mine. But you're not alone. Not anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. She squeezed my hand in return, and for the first time since we had met, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was faint, but it was there. I'll protect you, Sarah, I promised, my voice steady. I won't let anyone take you from me. As I stood up, I looked out the window. The storm had cleared, but the night was still heavy with uncertainty. I had no idea what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. I had a purpose now, and that purpose was to keep her safe, no matter what it took. I sat in the silence of the cabin, the air thick with uncertainty. The only sound was the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as Sarah shifted uneasily on the couch. I could feel the weight of the world pressing down on me, but I wasn't going to let it break me. Not now. Not when Sarah was depending on me. The Hell's Angels were out there, circling like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness. I knew they would come for me, eventually, but I wasn't going to run anymore. I had fought my entire life to survive, but now, for the first time, I had something worth fighting for. Something more than just myself. Something real. I looked over at Sarah, sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said much since we arrived at the cabin, and I could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. I could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty of not knowing what came next. But there was something else too, a flicker of hope, as if she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. I walked over to her and sat down beside her, trying to keep my movements calm, steady. I couldn't let her see how shaken I was. I couldn't let her know that a part of me was terrified. Not because of the Hell's Angels, not anymore, but because of how much I cared for her. Sarah, I said, my voice low and gentle. I need you to understand something. No matter what happens, I'm here. And I won't let anything happen to you. I promise. She looked at me then, her eyes wide, searching my face for any hint of doubt. But there was none. I meant every word. You don't have to be afraid anymore, I continued. We're in this together, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. She bit her lip, her eyes dropping to the floor for a moment, before she looked back up at me. I'm scared, Reaper, she whispered. Her voice was so small, so fragile, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. I don't know what to do. I reached out and took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. I know, I said softly, but we're going to figure it out. Together. There was a long pause as she stared at our intertwined hands, the weight of the moment sinking in. I wasn't sure if she believed me, but I had to believe it. For both of us. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, before she spoke again. What if they come after us? Her voice cracked with fear, and I could hear the vulnerability in her words. I didn't have an answer for that. I couldn't promise her that everything would be okay, but I could promise her that I would fight for her. I would fight with everything I had. If they come, I said, my voice steady and sure, we'll be ready. And if it comes to it, I'll protect you with my life. She nodded, her expression softening slightly, but I could still see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that lingered beneath the surface. I couldn't blame her. She had been through too much. But I knew that together, we could face whatever was coming. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside me was just beginning. I had made my choice. I had walked away from the Hell's Angels, but I knew that walking away didn't mean I was free. It just meant that I had to fight for my freedom, fight for Sarah, and fight for a life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder every second. I stood up, pulling my jacket on, feeling the weight of the leather against my shoulders. I wasn't the same man I had been when I first put it on, but it still felt like a part of me. I'm going to take a walk, I said, glancing over at Sarah. I need to clear my head. Stay here, and lock the door behind me. She nodded, but I could see the uncertainty still in her eyes. I hated leaving her, but I needed to think. I needed to plan. The cabin was small, tucked away in the woods, far from the city, and even farther from the Hell's Angels. But I knew they wouldn't stop looking for me. They never did. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, the silence was deafening. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. I walked toward the edge of the property, my thoughts racing. I couldn't do this alone. I knew that now. Sarah had given me a reason to keep going, a reason to fight. But the road ahead was uncertain. The Hell's Angels would come for me, and when they did, they wouldn't just walk away. They would bring everything down on us. I had to be ready. And so did she. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I didn't have all the answers. Maybe I didn't know what the future held. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. I stood outside in the cold, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground as I thought about everything that had led me here. The past, the Hell's Angels, and the broken man I had been, the one I had to leave behind. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without cost, but it was a choice I had to make. Now, standing in front of the small cabin where Sarah was waiting, I knew the hard part wasn't over. It was just beginning. She was my reason for pushing forward, my reason to fight for something different. But the Hell's Angels didn't let people go that easily. They would come. They would always come. I had to be ready. But the thought of losing Sarah, of her getting caught in the crossfire, was something I wasn't willing to accept. I couldn't let that happen. I stepped back inside, my boots clicking against the wooden floor as I made my way to where Sarah was sitting. She looked up at me, her eyes still filled with that quiet uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something else there now, something softer. She was beginning to trust me, little by little. And that was all I needed. "Sarah," I said, sitting down beside her. She looked at me, her gaze hesitant but steady. "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about the Hell's Angels anymore. This is about us, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. You don't have to be afraid." She didn't say anything at first, but her hand reached out, brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "I'm not afraid of you, Reaper," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm afraid of what's out there. I don't know what's going to happen next." I took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "I know," I said softly. "But you're not alone. We'll face it together." For a moment, we just sat there in the silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. I could feel the storm brewing outside, but it wasn't the weather that worried me. It was the people I had left behind. The people who wouldn't let me go without a fight. But I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I was done running, done hiding. I had made my choice, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. I stood up, my eyes meeting Sarah's one last time before I turned to leave the cabin. "Stay here," I said. "I'm going to handle this. I'll be back soon." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't want me to leave, and I didn't want to leave her either. But I had no choice. This was something I had to do. I couldn't let them come for her. I had to face them head on. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin as I mounted the Harley once more. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. The Hell's Angels were coming, and I had to be ready for them. As I rode through the night, the world around me felt like it was closing in. The streetlights blurred as I sped down the road, my mind racing with the thought of what was to come. I couldn't help but wonder if I was doing the right thing. Was it worth it? Was it worth risking everything for someone else? But I knew the answer. It was worth it. Sarah was worth it. I wasn't going to let the Hell's Angels destroy what little good I had left in this world. The wind whipped through my hair as I pushed the bike faster, my focus narrowing. I had one goal: to protect Sarah, to keep her safe. And if the Hell's Angels tried to stop me, then they would have to go through me first. I pulled up to the old warehouse, the place where it had all started. The place where I had joined the Hell's Angels all those years ago. The place where everything had fallen apart. I parked the bike, the engine's roar dying down as I stepped off and walked toward the door. It was time to face them. Time to end this. I pushed the door open, the familiar scent of oil and leather hitting me like a wave. The room was dimly lit, but I could see the figures standing inside. Steele, along with a few of his men, were waiting for me. "You still don't get it, do you, Reaper?" Steele's voice was low and dangerous, the same tone he used when he wanted to remind me that I was nothing without the club. "You can't just walk away. You belong to us." I didn't flinch. "I don't belong to anyone anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I'm done with this life. And I'm done with you." Steele's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You'll regret this. You think you can just turn your back on the Brotherhood?" I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. "We'll see about that," Steele said, stepping toward me. "You've made your choice, Reaper, and now you'll pay the price." I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what was coming. But this time, I wasn't going to fight for their approval. I wasn't going to fight for anyone but myself. And for Sarah, I would protect her. And no one, no matter how many of them there were, was going to take her from me.